I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the latest updates from the battlefront, north, south and east. We dig into the composition and tactics of the Ukrainian army, and we ask why Russia has resorted to buying millions of artillery shells and rockets from North Korea.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 7th of September, day 196. And today I'm joined by Associate Editor Dom Nichols and our Assistant Comment Editor, Francis Durnley. I started by asking Dom for his thoughts on the Ukrainian counteroffensive.
Hi David, hi everybody. It's been very busy, as you say, particularly in the east. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Let me deal with the south. So the Kherson front is still very, very active. There's reports of the Ukrainian push down there still continuing, having some measures of success, but also it looks like they have been blunted in some areas. Now, this is to be expected as we think this is a sort of four-pronged push in the south. The two roads from Mykolaiv to Kherson city itself, one going direct and one along the coastline, and then another route down through the sort of Inelets River in the centre of that pocket, and then one further to the east. So what we thought they were doing was testing, seeing where the opposition was strongest, and then trying to reinforce those areas where the opposition is weakest. So, of course, there's going to be some reversals in that and some repulsed attacks. That seems to be what we are seeing there. Further to the east, now we talked about it yesterday, and to be perfectly honest, we're not entirely sure what is happening because there's scant information coming out. The Ukrainian leadership are still very much keen on, or have imposed a news blackout is too strong, but they are not allowing the free flow of press, accredited press in the area, as has been in the earlier months in the war. Anyone trying to get in there to report is at risk of losing their accreditation. So we're not getting a lot of free voices, or a lot of freelance voices or accredited journalists out of there. But it seems that the town of Balaklia, and please apologies as always for my pronunciation, seems to have been overtaken by Ukrainian forces. Now, this was a previously Russian-held town, about 40-odd miles southeast of Kharkiv. It's just west. It's about 10 miles, 15 k's-ish, 16 k's to the west of the main road running out of Kharkiv, running sort of southeast into Izium and then on to Sloviansk. It seems as if that has been taken by a Ukrainian push. This is largely coming from Russian, Russian telegram channels, with some backed up in some areas by video and photographic evidence that we think is accurate and date worthy, i.e. it's from the last 24 hours rather than months ago. But as I say, you've got to take everything with a pinch of salt here. But it looks as if the town of Balaklia has been taken by Ukrainian forces. There are reports that Russian reserves have had to be pushed into Shevchenkoye, which is further along, is across that road, across that main road from Kharkiv down to Sloviansk, and further in that axis. If you went from Balaklia and headed northeast, which looks like the axis of advance from Ukraine, then Shevchenkoye is about 20 or 30 k's along there. So if Russian reserves have had to be deployed in that area, then it looks as if that certainly something is happening, and it looks as if there has been a breakthrough. There. So we're not entirely sure what's happened there. Again, a lot of Russian telegram channels, so you've got to take this with a pinch of salt, but there's a number of different reports all sort of saying the same thing, that they were subjected to a very sort of sudden assault. They don't use the term combined arms, but I mean that's what happened. Combined arms being the integral knitting together of infantry and tanks and artillery and engineer support and electronic warfare and all the rest of it. All the parts of the orchestra working together. It does seem as if that has had some measure of success, and it looks as if the speed of the advance, breaking through what we think was defended by the sort of reservists, if you like, or the Luhansk self-proclaimed Luhansk People's Republic forces. They've just not been able to. They are not at the caliber. They don't have the weapons of the caliber. or the training to repulse a proper, well supported, well coordinated attack led by infantry and armour. And it looks as if there's comments about the speed of the advance meant that Russian artillery was just out of date. By the time it had been able to range in on a target, they were gone. They were another couple of Ks up the road. So it looks as if artillery has largely been nullified by the speed of the advance, and it looks as if that advance does seem to be having quite some success in the area. Now, what does that mean? We spoke yesterday about whether or not, where's the deception, where's the feint? Can Ukraine afford, in terms of personnel and equipment, to push on all fronts in the north and in the Donbass and in southern Kherson? We thought that was not the case. So is this an opportunistic push? Now, the Kyiv Independent media outlet is quoting the Institute for the Study of War, a US-based think tank, saying that this push is a likely opportunistic effort enabled by the redeployment of Russian forces to the south. Now, that seems plausible, seems logical. My only caveat there is that I look at the ISW, Institute for the Study of War, recommend other people do as well. They're a credible outlet for information. I've not seen that report that Kyiv Independent are quoting. So, again, pinch of salt all over the place. I'm getting surrounded by salt here. However, another bizarrely credible, I say bizarrely because we're talking about Igor Girkin here, who's the former FSB guy, the Russian intelligence agent, former military leader of the Donetsk, again, self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic. He has talked about this rapid advance led by infantry and armour, and talked about the inability of the defenders there to muster a strong enough defence, both at the first and the second line. And he also made the comment about artillery. Now, as our friend and colleague Roland Oliphant mentioned the other day, when we were discussing, well, how much can we rely on these kind of channels? Igor Girkin is in that kind of bracket that he's such an ultra nationalist for Russia. He's so in support of this endeavour that he is quite vocal on calling out Russia when they make mistakes, when they're not progressing fast enough and eliminating Nazis left, right, and centre. He calls them out. So we actually get quite a lot of information that subsequently turns out to be accurate from his channel, and long may he continue. So something is definitely happening there in the east. Whether or not it's opportunistic or whether or not it is a planned advance, the ultimate aim could be if they progress there to the east and southeast of Kharkiv, that will cut the supply lines coming down from Russia itself down into the Donbass. So combine that with the push in the Donbass, this could be a front to stymie Russian ambition in the Donbass. Of course, I know the aims keep changing, but Putin's latest claim is that this war is all about liberating, in his words, the Donbass. So they've got to keep going. They cannot afford to not take the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. They've got to take the Donbass. So if this effort around Kharkiv, knitting together with the thing that's happening in the Donbass that we talked about yesterday, this very, very odd, sort of very limited counterattack in an area crossing the Donetsk River. If this is all part of severing those logistic links down into the Donbass, then that will severely impact one of Russia's stated aims. And just to finish off there, excuse me, today's UK Defence Intelligence report, which again, you can accuse me of just spouting propaganda from the Ministry of Defence, but it does seem to be fairly credible. They're saying that multiple concurrent threats spread across 500 kilometres will test Russia's ability to coordinate operational design and reallocate resources across multiple groupings of forces. Earlier in the war, Russia's failure to do this was one of the underlying reasons for the military's poor performance. So a little bit wonkish, but when it talks about operational design, it means big picture stuff. I mean, where do you put your major forces? Where do you hold? Where do you push? Where do you defend? How do you allocate limited resources against multiple competing demands? And they've not shown themselves, Russia have not shown themselves very good at doing that at a ground level. Reallocating resources across multiple groupings of forces across a 500-kilometre front is a very tricky thing to do. And they've not shown, as I said, great ability to do that in the past. So I think that's a fairly credible report there from UK Defence Intelligence. And it all suggests that there are two big pushes now from Ukraine in the south around Kherson and in the north/east, all impacting the Donbass. Whether they've got the the military power, the military means to do both as they should do, fully supported with a very coherent logistical plan. Amateurs do tactics, professionals do logistics, etc., etc. Unless they've got all that, then one of those things has to give. And we spoke yesterday about where's the main attack, which one's the deception. The jury's still out on that completely. I'm happy to flick flack so we cover all bases and get it right. But I genuinely don't know. Genuinely don't know at the moment. But there does seem to be Ukrainian advance both in the south, very very limited, a lot of hard fighting, but also this sudden thrust, this sudden push from the southeast of Kharkiv in a northeasterly direction. I think I better pause there. We'll grab our compasses and try and work out which way's up.
Thanks, Dom. That was incredibly comprehensive and I think has given us a very good understanding of what's happening across Ukraine from the south to the north. We'll come back to you later because I've got some questions on the fighting itself, and I'd like us to spend some time thinking about how the Ukrainians might fight given their training from Western powers. But before that, let's go to Francis Sterney. Francis, welcome back. What other updates outside of the actual fighting have you got for us today?
Well, thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be back after a couple of days' absence. I've actually just left watching Prime Minister's Questions on the television here at Telegraph Towers. Now, for the benefit of our foreign listeners, Prime Minister's Questions is when, once a week, the sitting Prime Minister takes questions from members of Parliament of all political persuasions, and it's effectively a wonderful spectacle, carnival of democracy in action, where, as I say, members of Parliament are scrutinising the legislative agenda of the government and can ask questions on the highest scale of policy, whether it be war in Ukraine or on the economy and the cost of living crisis, down to a leisure centre in their constituency. So one of the sort of most curious features of British politics, but again, one of the, I think, best features about it is that you really get the sense of what is on the agenda on any given week. And so in that half an hour, it's also an opportunity to measure the strength of the Prime Minister. And of course, we have a new Prime Minister in Liz Truss, who took over yesterday. I mean, can you imagine taking over in a new job and then on the first day in that new job having to face questions, hostile questions, for 35 minutes from those who are trying to trip you up? It's no mean feat. And she did a pretty good job of it, I think it's fair to say. I mean, I'm not saying that in an ideological sense. I mean, just purely, she didn't make any big mistakes. She batted off a lot of criticism. She got a few laughs from her fellow MPs, and generally speaking, was pretty robust on her agenda, which of course includes tackling the cost of living crisis, but also remaining robust on Ukraine. And indeed, it was noteworthy, I think, to see that she was wearing a Ukraine-British flag brooch, the two flags alongside each other. And she did speak about Putin's war and her resilience and strength on that issue. She also, of course, spoke to President Zelensky last night and was the first foreign leader to do so. So I think it's clear that she remains as strong on this issue as Prime Minister as she was as Foreign Secretary. It's we've got a piece in the paper coming up tomorrow, and indeed it's being written as we speak by Colin Coughlin, who's our regular defence columnist, who is going to do a little deep dive into Liz Truss's time as Foreign Secretary and indeed her successor, James Cleverly, and analysing what they're likely to do in the coming days and weeks ahead. He makes the point, which I think is accurate, is that at this moment, I think it's fair to say that Russia is on the back foot, and her instincts as Foreign Secretary, echoed, of course, by Boris Johnson, have been proven correct about the way to respond to Putin's aggression and invasion of Ukraine. And indeed, he's going to go on to argue that this is her moment to ensure that Putin is defeated, perhaps even for good in Ukraine, because at the moment there are still dangers. Of course, in the United States, whilst they remain still very robust on the issue of Ukraine, we are about to enter the midterms, and the focus will inevitably enter domestic affairs as opposed to foreign affairs across the pond. Not only that, in European countries I've spoken to many times on this podcast, there is, I think, less clarity on on some commitments from certain countries, and so there is a real vacuum that is to be filled, I think, by another British Prime Minister, to be as strong as Boris Johnson was on these issues, and to counter the so-called geopolitical realists, those who think that war can never be won, and thus peace has to be the goal in the short term, and that the cost of living crisis isn't worth the cost of Ukraine's freedom. And that there's an opportunity here for that argument really to be made as passionately and robustly as Boris Johnson was making it, not only now but in the months ahead. So a very interesting first Prime Minister's questions, a first day in office for Liz Truss, and no doubt she'll have a lot more to say on Ukraine in the coming days.
Absolutely. Thank you, Francis. I would say to our listeners, different opinions on the entertainment value of PMQs are available, but why don't you go and watch yourself and let us know what you think next week. Also, very quickly as well, we often encourage our listeners to write in with ideas, suggestions and critiques. We know lots of our listeners are based in the United States, so I'd be very interested to hear from you how the Ukraine invasion is starting to play in the midterms. What are politicians saying? What are the public thinking about it? And how is public opinion shifting or staying the same? So if you've seen anything in the States, do let us know. We'd be very, very curious to hear. It was a big day for Liz Truss. It was also a big day for Vladimir Putin. He was at the Eastern Economic Forum, a sort of Davos style forum in the east of Russia in Vladivostok. He said quite a few things, Francis. I think it'd be useful to dwell on it, because what he says is potentially indicative of how Russian leadership are thinking about the war, and certainly what they might be concerned about and the image they're trying to project. So could you just talk to us a little bit about what Vladimir Putin said and what we can say from that?
Sure, yes. Well, I apologise to our listeners if I was rather overexcited about Prime Minister's questions. I did used to work in Parliament for 3.5 years, so this is the sort of thing that gets me all very overexcited. But yes, on Putin, it was, as you say, a significant 24 hours. He's denied, remarkably, using energy as a weapon during the Ukraine war. He says, and I quote, "They say," of course he's alluding here to the Western powers, "that Russia uses energy as a weapon. More nonsense. What the weapon do we use? We supply as much as required according to requests from importers." That's what he told the Economic Forum that David was just talking about. Now, of course, we know that this is not true, because there is inevitably, as a consequence of Europe being reliant on Russian energy, there has been more of a demand than Russia has been willing to give in recent weeks with the closure of these key pipelines. And yet, it is clearly a deliberate policy on the half of the Kremlin to strangle Europe. It's not about what Europe is demanding. It is about what it is willing to offer. Russia is willing to offer Europe. And so I think we should take that, as Don was talking earlier on about taking things with a pinch of salt. Well, I think this requires a full handful of salt, frankly, if you're to believe what Putin is saying here. He says, and remarkably, he also said, "Give us a turbine and we will turn Nord Stream on tomorrow." Now, we've, throughout this crisis, have been saying on this podcast that this was almost certainly going to be Putin's line, that he would dangle the carrot of solving the cost of living crisis, solving the energy crisis overnight, if sanctions on Russia were relinquished. And that indeed is exactly what he is doing here. He's putting on a facade of strength at a time of real vulnerability, not only militarily but economically in Russia, in an attempt to basically say that you're about to have it really bad in Europe, and it doesn't have to be this way. I'm fine, my economy is robust, we've ridden the wave, as it were, and all you need to do is end this. Give me what I want, which is control over the pace and duration of the Ukraine war and certain assurances, and it can all be over tomorrow. But as I say, I think we need to be very questioning of this narrative being put forward by Putin on so many fronts, but not least the fact about this economic strength provided of the Russian economy at present, which, as I've talked about many times on the podcast, is highly, highly questionable. It's the illusion of strength that is effectively achieved through the dark arts and machinations behind closed doors, which will not be sustainable in the long term. So that's what he made his remarks about on the energy front. He also talked generally about the West's sanctions, calling them short-sighted and a danger for the entire world. Again, saying that the threat of economic fragility in Europe is a consequence of Western decision-making as opposed to Russian ones. He said that the sanctions have replaced the COVID-19 pandemic as the main threat to the global economy. And I'll quote him in full here. "I'm speaking of the West sanctions fever, with its brazen, aggressive attempt to impose models of behaviour on other countries, to deprive them of their sovereignty and subordinate them to their will." Now, it's fascinating again this, because what he's attempting to do is use the critics of Western countries, Western civilization, one might say, using their attack lines himself. So this idea of it being Russia that's taking away sovereignty from Ukraine. No, it's the Western powers that are taking away sovereignty from other nations by trying to impose their economic will on them. And also talk about their aggression. Look at this language. It's the same language that we've been using about Putin. He's trying to mirror it back, but in a way that plays to certain other narratives that are within the Western world around cultural imperialism, Western arrogance, all of these kind of things. He also said that irreversible and even tectonic changes have taken place throughout international relations. The role of dynamic, promising countries and regions of the world, primarily the Asia-Pacific region, have significantly increased. So again, he's trying to say that I don't really need to think about Europe long term. My eyes are on the Asia-Pacific and on the emerging economies, which again is what we knew that he would do, because those countries have been more receptive to his narrative around the Ukraine war, but also are dependent more on Russian energy and weapons. So naturally, they have not been able to criticize him as much, and as a consequence, he is now saying that they will be his main focus of attention in the long term. And again, we've predicted this on the podcast, that inevitably he would be forced to turn to the emerging economies, and the challenge now for the West is going to be to win them back.
Thanks for that, Francis. Dom, I know you had one quick point to make about some of the body language you saw in these images emerging from this conference.
Well, very quickly, not so much that conference, but the Vostok 2022, the East 2022 military drills that are happening in Russia at the moment, with Russia, China, Syria forces, Laos. I think we've got some forces there. The big military drills. It's on our website. Joe Barnes has written a piece about it. There's a bit of film, but just in it, you see Putin and Gerasimov, the head of Russia's armed forces, and they're later joined by Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, all there watching the military drills. But the body language there is absolutely excruciating. They don't talk to each other. It's awful. I mean, if ever there was a way of saying that they just don't like being in each other's company, then that's it. Now, they're quite. I'm not trying to make too much of this. They're quite stunted, these occasions. Anyway, we've seen Putin do a sort of school headmaster type affair with Shoigu before, but it is quite telling. It's just something that we just don't see elsewhere. I mean, you normally kind of acknowledge your defence minister when he walks in the room, maybe even give him a smile. I doubt it. But so Joe Barnes has written about that. I just thought it's quite an interesting counterpoint to this, to give in terms of imagery what it means and trying to sort of sell yourself to the world.
Thanks for that. Dom, let's move away from the Far East, come back to Europe. There's been some updates from the EU in response to some of the questions emerging over energy. Francis, can you talk us through them?
Yes, well, the European Commission has today proposed a further €5 billion in macro financial assistance loans to Ukraine as the second part of its exceptional package of up to €9 billion, which was announced back in May, I believe. I think it was the 18th of May, and endorsed by the European Council on the 23rd, 24th of June. So again, these are the kind of things that don't really pick up much attention, but are of huge significance. Without this kind of financial support, then Ukraine would be in a really, unsalvageable economic situation. And the fact that the EU is continuing to provide this financial support is really, really important in enabling Ukraine's capacity to fight. Now, on the energy point, we're just talking about energy. The EU is also drawing up plans for an EU cap of €200, that's about £173 per megawatt hour, on the price of electricity from generators that do not run on gas. Now, that's according to a draft that's been seen by Reuters, the news agency. So clearly they're drafting emergency measures here to pull down the gas and electricity costs that are expected to rocket this winter. And by putting a price cap on Russian gas, they're hoping that on the one hand this will help alleviate the cost of living crisis on how much individuals are paying, but also it will ensure that Putin is not able to continue to profit as insanely as he has been able to do, or at least by the extreme margins that he has been able to in the long term, because the demand of energy has been higher. Even though less of it is being purchased, because of the cost price has gone up, he is still making exorbitant profits. And so Ursula von der Leyen, of course, as the European Commission president, has said, we will propose a price cap on Russian gas. We must cut Russia's revenues, which Putin uses to finance this atrocious war in Ukraine. So again, a robust response from the EU that echoes many others that are taking place around the world at present. Just one other thing whilst talking about this in relation to the EU is that Hungary, which of course we've talked about at length in the past as perhaps, almost certainly the strongest ally that Russia has within the European Union. Hungary has backed down in its threat to veto the next rollover of Russian sanctions on September the 15th. So they were threatening to do that because of the ongoing crisis, but they have said that no, they will continue to support Russian sanctions for now. Budapest said that they would raise the issue again for the next rollover, which is due, I think, in November, December time. So clearly, for now, the line is holding within the European Union on sanctioning Russia. But will that remain robust in the long term, particularly if Hungary is wobbling come November, December time? It's too early to say. But the fact that they've been managed to be kept on side at this moment, I think, is significant.
Thanks, Francis. There's just one more thing I think we should talk about, and we don't know how much we need to talk about it, but we'll see what analysis we can come up. There's a story that Russia has resorted to buying millions of artillery shells and rockets from North Korea. Can we talk a little bit about this? What might this show us about the Russian armed forces?
Well, I think very simply, it speaks to two things. The first is it speaks to the desperation that it is being required to purchase weaponry from another state, which is never a great look when you're seeing yourself as a foremost military power. But second, it speaks to what we've spoken about again in the past on this podcast, which is that Russia is desperate for allies. And indeed, North Korea is one of the very, very few that has answered the call, as it were, that is willing to deal with Russia. And so, these things are always when one is publicly talking about supporting another country, it's usually not only because it's beneficial for that country, but of course it's also beneficial for you. And this is of huge significance, of course, for North Korea. It requires support from countries like Russia to remain economically solvent. Most of its support comes from China, but some of it comes from Russia. But also they will inevitably have agreed and signed off to this being public knowledge, and they deem that being beneficial, that this is them making it clear which side that they're on in this sort of new emerging Cold War between autocratic and democratic spheres of influence, if one can articulate it in that way. And I think it's as I say, it's significant for those two main reasons, but also just generally for, I think, speaking to the desperate situation that Russia is in at this moment, because it would not be wanting to. If you'd said at the beginning of this war that they would have to be resorting to North Korea as one of their central military allies, then I think that they would have been horrified at that notion. Russia likes to see itself as a global power, one with reach and influence. And if all you can summon really to your support is North Korea, it's not the look that you would want to go for. Now, more positively for Russia, I think it has to be said, is what they've managed to achieve in there being the first large-scale war games involving China and other Kremlin-friendly allies, which took place yesterday. Putin was there. He flew to Vladivostok for the live-fire exercise in the Sea of Japan. He was joined by Sergei Shoigu, who we've spoken about at length, which in itself is interesting because the talk was that he'd been sidelined. So it would appear that this is a sort of show of, at least a facade of a show of strength. And they were watching the war games take place. Now, as I say, this is good for Russia in the sense that China agreed to take part. So did India as well, Syria. And yet at the same time, I think perhaps we shouldn't completely overestimate the significance of this. This had been in the calendar for quite some time. It's one of those things that perhaps it would be quite difficult for China to roll back on, considering what's been going on with Taiwan, and they clearly want to send a signal to the world that they could still be more closely aligned with Russia. But I think that reading this, as some commentators are online, as being a mark of World War III preparatory exercises is way off the mark. These kind of war games take place relatively often, but nonetheless, I think Russia will be pleased that they have gone ahead, and we know as well that Putin will be meeting the Chinese premier next week in Uzbekistan. That's been confirmed by both channels, and so that is again something that I think Putin will see as a diplomatic win, that he's gone from being a complete pariah early on in this conflict to now being somebody who at the very least people are willing to be seen with in public, although as I say, the degrees to which they're actually willing to support him I think remains to be seen.
Thanks, Francis. Dom, do you want to add anything on to this?
Well, the only thing I'd add is that in terms of sourcing military hardware from abroad, it's unless they're doing it very, very quietly, and I think we would have found out, it seems like China is being very cool in this regard, really not stepping forward, particularly in the area of microprocessors. And we know that Russia's using a lot of precision-guided munitions and is suffering from a lack of very sophisticated technology that it's trying to source from around the world. So just surprising that China is sort of notable by its absence, I would say, when it comes to lending overt military support to Russia.
Thank you very much, Dom, and thank you, Francis. Just one more question I'd quite like to talk about a little bit, and I sort of do realise it's quite speculative, but as we've been talking earlier on today and yesterday in this podcast, it's often very difficult to know what's going on the front lines. Information comes either not at all or very, very fast, and we have to spend a little bit of time sifting through it to work out what we can verify and what we can't. Dom, I was talking to you earlier about considering that we know that lots of the Ukrainian army have been trained by NATO powers or Western powers, could you sketch out for us how they might fight? What would the battle look like with the Ukrainians going forward from what we know about their training?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll try and keep it brief. So the way we try and do it in the West is we go for the phrase you would have heard me use a number of times, combined arms manoeuvre. So you have little packets of infantry and tanks and, let's say, engineers and some signalers and some intelligence and artillery, electronic warfare, logisticians, etc., all working together. Now, it's tricky. Okay, the military business is fairly tricky. It's a tricky game. So mastering your own skill set, if you're a tank driver or if you are a gunner in the artillery or anything else, just mastering your own trade takes a while. To then be asked to make sure you know a sufficient amount, which is quite a lot, of your cousins next door, so that you can work seamlessly together. Well, that's an even bigger ask, and then to do it in contact with the enemy in the chaotic nature of the battlefield, where information is scarce and you don't know what's going on and you're scared and all the rest of it. So working together is quite tricky. But if you have these small building blocks, let's just say you've got a building block of 4 things: so infantry, tanks, artillery, and engineers. So you've got those 4 building blocks. Well, when that little blob of combat power meets another identical blob of combat power, they can work together much quicker, because they already know how to work with each other. And then this other force that they've come up against, these other friends, are just sort of more of the same. So you can actually knit things together much quicker in that kind of mold. Now, the Russian way of doing things from the Soviet era was to be deep specialists in their own areas and not particularly work together. I mean, there's no absolutes in this, of course, but the tanks would generally work on their own, and then the sort of APCs, the armored personnel carriers, would come in and ferry the troops around and what have you. But they were largely stovepipes of excellence, if you like to think of it in that way. They weren't very good at working together, and hence when, from Russia's point of view, friendly forces met up, they couldn't then just seamlessly immediately all work together and head off to glory, because they just didn't have this culture of working together seamlessly and understanding the limitations. I mean, literally the limitations of the speed of the vehicles, for example. We would I used to work in Chieftain a very long time ago, and we would go. We would be alongside our infantry buddies in the Warriors, and Warrior being a modern, well, then a modern vehicle, and Chieftain not so modern. The Warriors would outrun us. So as we were leaving the sort of start line for an attack on a position, the Warriors would have to have a head start, or we'd have to have a bit of a head start. So we arrived sort of in the close contact battle, that sort of, I guess, 600 metres and closer, at about the same time. So you weren't all over the place. So simply knitting things together like that, you have to understand how each other's operating, understand how long it takes to bring an artillery piece into action, for example, so that you know that even if you're exploiting a successful move on a position, you know, if you think, well, of course, the artillery will fire us into the next position in the next assault. Well, they might not be able to, because they take time to bring into action or to move. So you've got to have an understanding of what's the left and right and in front and behind you. And I think we do that in the or we train for it at least far better than the Russian doctrine teaches. Now, Ukraine's somewhere in the middle. It's sort of a lot of the old guard brought up on those old models, those kind of the post-Soviet era doctrine, and they are having to change both the natures of their ammunition. They're sort of shifting from 152mm artillery to 155. That doesn't sound a hell of a lot, but actually, you know, these are all different natures of equipment, all with their own logistic trails, all with their own sort of ways of being supported. So to shift your military doctrine from one method to another, one mode to another, one model, if you like, that's a word I'm increasingly poorly scrambling for, is hard. Now, and add to that, Ukraine are doing it in contact with the enemy. So it's very, very difficult to do. But if you are able to master it, and I'm not suggesting we in Britain have mastered it yet, but I think we're further down the line in Russia. If you are better able at inculcating in your military forces this understanding that you are going to come across other friendly forces, and you're going to have to or the quicker you can integrate and work together, then the faster you can have an effect on the enemy. If you can inculcate that kind of idea and that mode of thinking, then that allows a higher tempo of operations and hopefully more success. And you only get that by practicing from a very, very low level. And a lot of this comes down to the basic educational achievements of the raw material you're dealing with, the people who are going into the military. If they are not, if the education system of your state is not such that they are able to take on board these ideas and learn them and really inhabit these modes of working, then it's even harder. So it's just two different models there. Now, what we seem to be seeing from Ukraine is that obviously they are a much smaller force, but they are working better as teams. They are better able to devolve decision making. So rather than having to wait for the general to decide what's going to happen next, it's those kind of decisions are pushed right down the chain, and it's the commander at an appropriate level, question, where is the appropriate level? I mean, that's what military forces have been trying to decide since the Greek Spartan War, I guess. But where is that decision? But people at much lower levels are able to decide that this is a threat. This is a new scenario. This has just happened. That's completely wiped out all the fundamentals of the decisions that have gone into doing what we're doing now. I need to react to that. Quick bit of thinking, quick bit of planning. This is what we're going to do before, or instead of having to put that kind of the new facts back up the chain of command, and radios might not be as good as you'd hope. Wait for a decision from on high to come down. So the Western model of operating allows for what it might lack in punch, because you don't have a company of 10 T-72s all just whacking through a gap in the woods. You're working with other forces. It allows for a much more nimble, much more coordinated attack, and then you're better able to exploit success and also react to surprises if need be.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dom. I thought that was really informative. I've just got one more question sort of around this. As we know, it's very difficult. We get these reports in, they come from different Telegram channels and different people on the ground who sort of feed information back, and we have to go off and verify it. And we're operating often without a lot of information. But just for our listeners, what kind of signs should they be listening out for that and the Ukrainian offensive might be going particularly well or stalling? What kind of reports might we start seeing?
Well, keep your eyes on the push in around Kharkiv, because this is either taking advantage of an opportunity, and that's great. We like opportunity, and if you can, as I've just said, if your forces are better able to quickly respond to a change in circumstances and push through a gap that suddenly appeared or that you found, that's fine. But how far do you go? Because you also have a logistic tail, and if you leave yourself exposed, as we saw with Russia in the opening days of the war, the Ukrainians were very good at allowing having the confidence to allow the tanks to go past and then hitting the logistic tail behind them. Well, I mean, that might happen to Ukraine if they are pushing to the northeast of Balakleya, and I've mangled them. I'm so sorry for the names here, but if they are pushing past that road that links Kharkiv down to Sloviansk, and they are pushing in a northeasterly direction, then they will culminate. As we said before, culmination is the point at which you're not retreating, but you can no longer make any further advance. You just need to rest, basically, refuel the vehicles, refuel the people, have a bit of a think about what's going on, so on and so forth. You can no longer take part in offensive action. So there comes a point this is part of the military judgment. How far do you go until you say stop and reconstitute? Do you keep pushing as far as you can if there's nothing in front of you, but that's exposing your tail to it's inviting a strike behind you? Or do you rush on to the next major civic centre, the next major crossroads, the railhead, whatever it may be? There's a great temptation to do that, but that's where this military art meets science, I would say. But yeah, so in the next few days, let's see whether this is opportunistic, this push in the north, or whether this actually speaks of a very well supported attack, and that's able to push on and sever that logistic line from Russia down to Izium. If that's the case, then I'm going to try and wipe out all our past podcasts and claim that I knew all along that this was the main attack and Kherson was the deception. But I'll come back to that.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dom. I don't know if we can wipe them out. I think they're all there, unfortunately. But if it's true that they've deceived you as well, then kudos to the Ukrainian armed forces. We're coming to the end of our time today. Francis, I'm curious. You mentioned you worked in and around Parliament before coming to join the Telegraph. Did you, just going back to our new Prime Minister, obviously our Ukrainian listeners and our foreign listeners potentially feel that they have quite a good knowledge and understanding of Boris, who's a very colourful, very lively character. Did you ever did you know Liz Truss at all when you were in Parliament? And if so, can you throw some light for our listeners about her character?
So I knew her team and met her a couple of times. Just context of what I used to do. So I used to be the chief of staff for my local MP from home, who was chair of the Prime Minister's policy board at the time. And that role essentially meant that he served as a conduit for policy ideas from MPs, whether they be in the cabinet or backbenchers, into the number 10 policy unit. It all sounds very fancy, but basically it's a conduit, it's a funnel for ideas from people in Parliament into government. And so as a consequence of that, you got to know a lot of other MPs personally, and also, of course, particularly their teams. A standard MP now will usually have a team anywhere between the size of 4 members to 8 usually, so it can vary. But there's all of these people have a team behind them, and that's before you even get into those who then have a role in the government, where they'll usually have a whole department and they'll have special advisors, etc. So these things are big operations, and there are people who you don't see who actually wield a lot more influence than you might expect, but who are sort of working the corridors of Westminster. But from that time when I was working in Parliament, I got to know her team very well for the simple fact of not only the fact that she was obviously very much working in the policy space, but also her team were just around the corner on the building that our office was in. So I got to know her team quite well. I mean, and I met her at 2 events, as I say, very briefly. One thing I will say is that I think, there's been some criticism of her being a poor communicator or at least not the most effective public speaker. I wouldn't renounce that criticism, but I would say that on one-to-one basis, she's much, much more personable than you might expect. She's very charming, much more smiley, quite fun, actually, I would go as far as to say, a bit cheeky. And so I would not be surprised if we see her tenure as Prime Minister as being marked by perhaps stronger relationships with international leaders than many commentators would expect. Because, as I say, I think it's part of her private personality that we see less of, but is well known in the corridors of Westminster, that she is somebody who talks to many of her colleagues and is popular, is well liked. And obviously what speaks to that is the fact that she has been now in the cabinet for a sustained period of time, longer than almost anybody else, and so she's considered a safe pair of hands and is also considered loyal. The other thing I would just say about that, you get to learn from time in Parliament is those who perhaps have a proper ideological underpinning, and those who are sort of more instinctive politicians. And what I mean by that is those who could actually articulate why they think what they think in a sort of intellectual manner. And Liz Truss can do that. Indeed, she has done that. She wrote a book called Britannia Unchained, along with now some of her fellow members of her cabinet, talking about how economically to unleash the potential of Britain. But of course, foreign affairs plays into that as well, talking about the role that international trade should play, and Britain as a sort of a nation that needs to be free to do more around the world. And so I think that's the other thing, as I would say, is there's been some criticism of her as being very flaky. And indeed, if you look at her record on certain issues, she's now obviously seeing herself more, or marketing herself more, as a strong Brexiteer in favour of Brexit, when actually she voted for Remain at the time. I think actually that on policies of economic and domestic affairs, she is more robust than people may actually expect. And indeed, just watching the Prime Minister's questions earlier on, I was quite struck by how she was able to quite convincingly articulate what her economic approach will be, which essentially is all about improving growth. And I won't go into all of that now, but nonetheless, it's interesting that she was able to willing to defend that at the dispatch box, whereas a lot of politicians, whenever they are in danger of getting into complicated economic matters, will just try and throw out a gag and move on to the next question. So I think we can expect to see a lot of that. But my last comment would just be that we don't really know the true Liz Truss. I think it's fair to say that she has manoeuvred herself quite sophisticatingly in recent years to be in a position where she could be the future Prime Minister. And it's the old maxim that you only really know a leader when they actually are fully in command. And who knows, there may well be some surprises yet to come about what she actually really wants to achieve, and the manner in which she'll seek to achieve that. I think she will have one or two tricks up her sleeve, put it that way. So those are my thoughts, David. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much, Francis. Hopefully that gives our international leaders a bit of a more intimate portrait of the new Prime Minister. And it'll certainly be fascinating to see how she interacts with Zelensky. We know that Boris Johnson and Volodymyr Zelensky had a very close and an obvious friendship. So it'll be very interesting to see if that's replicable with Prime Minister Truss. I do think, however, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time together today. So I'll just ask Dom and Francis for your brief, if that's okay, your final thoughts. Dom and Nichols first, please.
Sure, what mine would be keep your eyes on the northeast. Is that advance there a planned and coordinated combined arms push? And if you want to have a listen back on what I mean by combined arms for those people of a former armour background who have arrived late to the party, and you know who you are, please listen back on Twitter Space or the podcast later. Or was it an opportunistic push born of good intelligence to suggest that the Russian forces there were very weak and were not able to put up with an armoured advance? But yeah, keep an eye on the Kharkiv front.
Thank you, Dom. Francis Turnley, would you like the final words?
Well, I just wanted to focus on a very, very light story that's been taking Ukrainian social media by storm. And indeed, somebody actually sent it to me privately. And then we've now since covered the story as some other news outlets. And it's about a chimpanzee on loose in Kharkiv. I mean, I know it sounds ridiculous, but effectively escaped the zoo in Kharkiv and was on the loose, and had to be coaxed back to the zoo after being offered a jacket and a warm hug by one of its keepers. But it's a really, it's it pales in significance to almost everything else that we've discussed today. But it made me smile, and it's clearly making a lot of Ukrainians smile. And so if people feel the need after a very depressing week of analysis, particularly reading about the military consequences of what's been going on, then this is just a lighter story that I'd point people to.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.